Chapter 11. Cerveza Schaefer es la mejor cuando se toma más de una. Kenny Moy was sitting next to Tito Aurora in front of the TV, belting out the beer jingle. That was pretty much the extent of his Spanish, but it didn't prevent him from bonding with Tito Aurora. They conducted bizarrely bilingual conversations while watching pro wrestling together. Titi would be bobbing up and down, screaming at the referee, cheering on her favorite of the day. I loved to watch her. Wrestling was the only thing that made her loosen up and enjoy herself. It reminded of Pappy's periodic emergence from his mournful silence to root for the Yankees on Abuelita's little black and white TV. But the Sheik, the Crusher, Killer Kowalski, Gorilla Monsoon, how could Titi believe this was for real? Ken Moy was the student coach of the girls' team of the forensics club at Cardinal Spellman. I had signed up as part of my self-imposed pre-professional program in public speaking, which advanced whenever an opportunity presented itself. The dozen or so girls on the team were an especially interesting bunch of self-selected high-functioning nerds, and Kenny coached us in debate and extemporaneous speech. He was brilliant at debate. His mind was an analytical machine that could dismantle an opponent's position step by inexorable step. His affirmative arguments would make a concrete bunker look like a house of cards, and he was utterly untainted by emotion. I aspired to be like Ken's unflappable, rational, cool, though I feel that I came across more like Titi Gloria and the usual nervous tizzy that accompanied her every mundane decision. Red dress or blue? Sonia, I don't care if you have to cut off your hands. Get that jester out of your rapport. That was Kenny ringside. Tell a Puerto Rican not to talk with her hands. Ask a bird not to fly. Ken should have gone to Bronx Science, but his mother made him come to Cardinal Spellman to keep an eye on his sister. Janet was a radical individualist with a completely uncensored approach to the world, a ticking time bomb in a Catholic school. She even cursed the principal to his face in the cafeteria when he caught her holding hands with her boyfriend. Ken had to tax his mighty rhetorical powers to win her a reprieve. But the truth was that if Janet had been expelled, Ken would have left too, and the school would have lost a star pupil. They lived in East Harlem, where their parents ran a Chinese hand laundry. I never visited Ken's home or met his parents. His dad was trouble three ways, he said: heroin, gambling, and a violent temper. But since they lived almost an hour away by subway, we hung out at my place. Ken claimed they were the only Chinese family in the barrio, and he was a barrio kid through and through, slamming down dominoes with the best of them. He was skinny as a knife blade, but he could eat more of Mammy's rice and beans and chuletas in one sitting than the rest of us together. In philosophy class, we were studying logic. I'm not sure what I expected of philosophy, but formal logic took me by surprise. I loved it. I perceived beauty in it, the idea of an order that held me under any circumstance. What excited me most was how I could immediately apply it down the hall in debate practice. I was amazed that something so mathematically pure and abstract could transform into human persuasion, into words with the power to change people's minds. Forensics Club was good training for a lawyer in ways that I barely understood at the time. You got handed a topic as well as a side you had to argue, pro or con. It didn't matter what you believed about the issue. What mattered was how well you argued. You not only had to see both sides, you had to prepare as if you were arguing both in order to anticipate your opponent's move. In allotted 5 minutes, you had to use your language carefully to paint a picture for those who would decide the match. Then you had to listen. Half the debate is listening to what the other person says, Ken advised. It was easy to present your own points, much harder to listen well enough to respond effectively to your opponent. Listening was second nature to me. My friends confided in me, unloaded their problems, and leaned on me for advice, the same way my mother's friends leaned on her. When I was little, listening and watching for cues had seemed like the key to survival in a precarious world. I notice when people hesitate or get defensive, when they care more about what they're saying than they'll admit, or when they're too quick about brushing something off. So much is communicated in tone of voice, in subtleties of expression, and in body language. What Ken taught us was a different way of listening, more formal than my own intuitive skill. He taught us to pay attention for the vulnerable links in a chain of logic, the faulty assumptions and the supposed facts that you know you can challenge when your turn comes. But even as I absorbed Ken's logical strategies, I knew instinctively that emotion doesn't disappear. Much as you had to keep your own in check, there was still that of your listeners to consider. A line of reasoning could persuade, but so could a sequence of feelings. Constructing a chain of logic was one thing. Building a chain of emotions required a different understanding. I've made it to the finals of the extemporaneous top of page 114 speech competition. The timer starts and I pick up a piece of paper blindly. 3 topics based on current events. Choose one. I have 15 minutes to brainstorm and organize a 5 to 7 minute speech. 2 of the 3 are so loud with the din of the nightly news. Outrage at My Lai, the killings at Kent State, the Vietnam War spreading across the borders, the protests spreading across campuses, that it's hard to hear myself think. The third topic catches my eye. The cold-blooded murder of Kitty Genovese and the neighbors who witnessed it but did nothing. Closer to home, Queens instead of Cambodia, and it touches a nerve. The clock is running. What can I recall of this news report? Where do I want to take this? What's my purpose? What's the best point of entry? I'll start by painting a picture and remember to keep my hands still. On a cold night in early spring 6 years ago, a young woman drove home from the bar where she was working to her apartment in Queens. It was around 3 a.m. She parked her car in a nearby parking lot and was walking up the alley towards her building when a stranger appeared out of the shadows and approached her. Frightened, she ran, but he caught up with her. He stabbed her in the back. She screamed and cried for help. Several neighbors heard her cries and the struggle that ensued as Winston Moseley assaulted Kitty Genovese. I looked out and observed a rapt stillness in the room. I got them. But the night was cold and the windows were closed. Those who heard thought it was probably just a lover's quarrel or a couple of drunks getting rowdy. Kitty Genovese screamed and screamed for help, and as her assailant punched and beat her over the head, stabbed her repeatedly, and bruised her all over her body. Finally, he raped her as she lay dying. When it was all over, one of the neighbors called the police. They arrived within minutes, but Kitty Genovese died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. Winston Moseley got away that night. He was apprehended later on a burglary charge and confessed to the murder. He's locked up for life. That's not what I'm concerned with today. No, what concerns me is this. 38 neighbors also confessed. Each one of them had heard or witnessed some part of the attack, which lasted over half an hour. 38 neighbors did nothing to intervene. They looked on and let this young woman die a horrible death. When I pause to look at the faces before me, I see an opening. These are bystanders, I imagine, sitting right here in the auditorium. How do I get past whatever it is that paralyzes them? How do I get them to step up and take responsibility? 38 neighbors did nothing. How does this happen? It happens when we become apathetic about our roles in society. It happens when we forget that we are a community, that we are connected to one another and have an obligation to engage with other human beings. Okay, I have to unpack this a bit, cover the basis, and circle back. A crime like what happened to Kitty Genovese may be the act of a deranged individual. Other crimes may be different in their causes, pointing to broader failures of society. But in the moment of opportunity, when a criminal grabs his chance and a victim is suffering, our own responsibility is the same. When the criminal finds his victim in a dark alley, an observer too has a moment of opportunity. Will you see the victim not as a stranger or as a statistic, but as another human being like yourself? Will you be fully human in that moment and feel the obligation to care, to act, to get involved? Will you be fully a citizen and rise to the responsibility? They're still with me, every one of them. So I start to sum up and come in for a landing. There was a young woman at the threshold of her life, a budding flower ready to open. And there's my hand, almost as if it doesn't belong to me, the finger cupped and opening in bloom, then closing to a hard fist. We destroyed that flower. The applause carries me down the steps. Ken is grinning broadly, proudly. They announce I've won first prize. A little cocky, I tell Ken. Sometimes talking with your hands is fine. It's who I am, where I come from. Interesting. That's probably why she started wanting to become a lawyer. I was doing my homework at the kitchen table, and Junior was doing his, as usual, in front of the TV when the door opened. Mamie made a dramatic entrance, slamming the stack of books in her arms straight down on the floor. I am not going back, she announced, her voice trembling. It's too much for me. I'm sorry I can't do it. Junior, get in here, I yelled. He appeared in the doorway instantly. If you can't do it, Mommy, then we can't either. Take a break, Junior. No more school for us. With both hands, I snapped shut the textbook I was reading, a very satisfying sound. I did glance at the page number first, though. This mutiny was incited only a few months after Mother had sat Junior and me down at the same kitchen table and asked whether we would be willing to make some sacrifices so she could study to qualify as a registered nurse. She had wanted years before to continue her schooling, but that hope was dashed when Pappy died. Over time, the salary she earned as a practical nurse lagged further and further behind what registered nurses was earning. She was worried that with her Social Security survivor's benefits ending when Junior and I finished school, she wouldn't be able to manage on her own. She certainly didn't want to lean on us to support her. She would have to tighten our belts for a while she took leave from the hospital to attend school. The money was not an insurmountable problem. My mother took a Saturday shift at a methadone clinic to make up a little bit of the lost income. I had worked the previous summer in the business office at Prospect Hospital, and they let me continue on weekends during the school year. Junior was working at Prospect 2 in reception, and he had a second job as a sacristan at St. Patrick's Cathedral. All the little pieces added up. No, the money was not the problem. The problem was my mom was scared out of her wits. Never mind that she was one very intelligent and ambitious woman. Never mind that Hostas Community College, where she enrolled, was specifically created to serve the South Bronx Latino community with a bilingual program for students like my mother. Never mind she had done the work of a registered nurse unofficially for years, if only because Prospect Hospital was so tiny and she was well trusted there. Never mind even that she had nursed half the residents of Hunts Point, Bronxdale, and Co-op City at one point or another. Do I exaggerate? Not much. My mother was tortured by lack of confidence in her own mental ability. She was especially terrified as soon as anything could be labeled as a math problem instead of just a matter of calculating a dosage. The word quiz was to her a stun gun. Most of the time, she beat back her fear with furious effort. She would crack her books as soon as she walked in the door, and midnight would find her still studying. Occasionally, though, anxiety got the best of her, and then it was that a bit of reverse psychology, some might say emotional blackmail, was in order. The idea that Junior and I might quit too, however improbable, was far more terrifying than any quiz. Seeing my mother get back to her studies was all the proof that I needed that a chain of emotion can persuade when one forge of logic won't hold. But more importantly was her example that a surplus of effort could overcome a deficit of confidence. It was something I would remember often in the years ahead whenever faced with fears that I wasn't smart enough to succeed. End of page 118.